see.
All right. Can everyone see my slide?
Yes,
all right.
I
Thank
can.
you. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation and the introduction, and having all of my friends and family show up to your meeting too. So I'm here to talk to you today about how habitat loss and fragmentation impacts native bee communities. And I'm dissecting work that someone has done in the past to show that bee communities are very different in habitats that are heavily fragmented versus large reserves. And I'm looking at traits that drive the differences between these communities. Before I really get going, I want to introduce you to my advisor and the person who really started this work. He founded it. So my advisor is Dr. David Hallway. He studies Argentine ants, and he has native bee folks in his lab sometimes as well, like myself and Dr. James Hung, who is a Hallway Lab alum, but now he is his own professor at the University of Oklahoma, continuing to study native bees. And he founded the sites that I'm resurveying for my PhD. So part of the reason that I'm so interested in bees is they are a perfect example of biodiversity. And when I first started thinking about biodiversity, I thought about number of species. So there are 1.2 million species that have been described in the world, but there are estimates that there are about 8 million, maybe over 30 million. No one's really sure. We're still working on it. But of the 1.2 million species that are described, 1 million are insects, and a large proportion of the large proportion of described species are insects, but more than just number of species, it's the interactions that these insects have with the environment that are so important. So biodiversity is more than just sheer number of species. It's the library of life. It's the genetic diversity, which we were talking about before this talk started, found in these species. It's the ecological roles that they maintain, and they also maintain ecosystem function. So decomposition, pollination, they can provide food sources. So you've probably seen birds munching on insects. So really important. And they also store nutrients. And all of these roles are so necessary for a functioning ecosystem. And E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous entomologists of all time, perhaps said, if invertebrates were to disappear, I doubt that the human species could last for a few months. And this was in his The Little Things That Rule the World piece written in Conservation Biology in 1987. And at that time, he was already aware and concerned about biodiversity loss. And he went further to say, within a few decades, the world would return to a state of 1 billion years ago, composed primarily of bacteria, algae, and a few other very simple multicellular plants. So all of these species without very many traits and a very bland planet that would perhaps rebound. But so this is why biodiversity is so important. And it was a big conversation in December at the UN Biodiversity Conference, where the UN discussed goals to guide global action through the year 2030 to support biodiversity. And they looked at the leading causes for biodiversity loss based on published work. And the number one thing driving change was land and sea use change. So habitat loss through urban development or agriculture, and fishing in seas. There's also direct exploitation. So cutting down trees for palm oil, or all sorts of ways to exploit the planet. Climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species are the 5 biggest concerns driving biodiversity decline. And one of the big things talked about among entomologists right now is the insect apocalypse. And these folks in Wagner and colleagues in 2021 found that a large proportion of species and groups have declining populations. So this figure on the left breaks down 5 different groups of insects, and all of the red is the proportion of species that are in decline of published studies. So of course, there are so many that we don't know about because no one is studying them. And also 30 to 60% of insect groups have negative population trends. But where are these data coming from is a big thing to look closer at that figure. And the same people compiled all of the studies that they looked at to make the previous figure. And you'll see all of these plots showing where they are gathering the data. And it's primarily in the Northern Hemisphere, in the US and in Europe, not very much in the Southern Hemisphere. And the place on the planet with the greatest biodiversity of all is along the equator. So there's a lot more research to be done, understanding where biodiversity loss is happening and why it's happening. So yes, it is probably happening, but we need more data. And this goes true for bees as well. So this is another piece that looked at what we know about baseline bee data globally, and areas that are yellow show where bees have been studied and sampled at all. Red areas are hotspots, so you might notice some familiar national parks or research stations are really red, where there have been lots of bee research done, but lots of the planet either hasn't digitized their museum records or hasn't looked at all for bees. So are bees in decline? Yes, probably, but again, we need more data. And to drive why bees are such a wonderful group to study for biodiversity is 80% of flowering plants depend on animal pollination to reproduce. So it's the interaction between the plant and the insect that is so important. And without pollinators, a third of plant species would not be able to produce seeds, and half plant species would have an 80% production in fertility. So a plant would still produce a seed, but it wouldn't be a very viable seed, and that seed's offspring would probably not be very successful. So bees are crucial pollinators, certainly not the only pollinators, but very special because their diet depends on pollen, whereas other pollinators are visiting flowers primarily to collect nectar and accidentally getting pollen on them. And so where bees are most diverse is right where we are, most of us anyway, in California. So the dark red all the way to black shows where there are most species found in the world. And the hotspot for bee diversity is different than most biodiversity globally. And it's found in Mediterranean areas and deserts, places where there is a timed synchronous bloom of plants. So if we think about a super bloom in the desert, which perhaps we're going to have this year, which is really exciting, all different plant species blooming at once, all of them requiring a pollinator to reproduce. And that is where bees have diversified the greatest. And it is important to bring up a bee that I field the most questions about, the Western honeybee. It was introduced to North America in the 1600s. It's native to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And it dominates floral resources in San Diego County, probably where you're at as well. And non-managed populations are not in decline, despite what a lot of people are saying. The populations that are wild in our area, feral, are not in decline. They're doing fine. And these bees have a very unique biology that separates them from other native bees. And that is because they're highly social. They're really cool. They can communicate with each other and say, hey, this is a really pasty patch of flowers over there. Send all the sisters to go and get the pollen. And other bees are primarily solitary and don't communicate in this way. And further, this type of bee is most diverse along the equator, unlike most other bees. So the bees that I study, this doesn't exhaust what they can look like, but this just shows the different forms that they can take, the different life histories they can take. Yeah. There are 700 species of bees in San Diego County alone, and not only species, but all of the functions these bees have. Some of them nest, some of them are social. Most of them are not social. Most of them are solitary. So a single mother carries out the entire tasks to build a nest cell, closes the nest cell, and never meets her offspring. Some of them are parasitic. So this bee here is a parasitic bee. And if you've heard of cuckoo birds, these bees do very much the same thing. They go and lay their eggs in other bees' nests. and their larva attacks the host's larva. And there are some social bees like bumblebees as well. And that means that they have a queen and workers and drones, but most other bees do not have that social caste system like bumblebees and honeybees do. Some bees have very specialized diets, only visiting one type of flower, or just a couple types of flowers in the same family. Others really don't care, and they will visit any flower for pollen and nectar. And some will fly very early in the season only, some will fly the entire season or very late. There are various nesting strategies. Some nest underground, some gather little pebbles to build a small nest on a rock or in a stem. Some will carpenter bees will build holes in trees or other wood. On the East Coast, carpenter bees can actually be quite a problem, building homes and decks in houses and stuff. But the trait that I'm most interested in right now is range size, and that is where the bee can live globally. And if they have a really large range size versus a really small range size, I'm wondering if these are traits that are associated with their ability to survive in very fragmented areas. So land use change is, like we learned earlier, one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. And this is especially prevalent across California. I took a close look at San Diego County specifically. So if you're familiar with a little bit eastern in San Diego, not the county, but the city, there's Lake Murray here. And this is imagery taken from an airplane to create topo maps in 1963. And we can orient ourselves with Lake Murray here and look at this canyon and see how in 1963, this canyon had an extra finger here, but now it's gone. And all of this area has been developed for homes. But some areas have remained. There are these fragments that are not connected to large reserves like here. And despite having very similar vegetation type, the plants found in these areas are far different. The bees found in these areas are far different than those found in really big reserves that make it easy for bees to disperse. So this really spurred a question for the person in the lab before me. Dr. James Hung was interested in how does habitat loss and fragmentation impact native bees? And he decided to find two different survey sites. There are reserves, which are large areas greater than 500 hectares surrounding scrub habitat, versus fragments, which are areas of the same vegetation type, but smaller, 120 hectares or smaller. And he put 1 hectare survey areas within these fragments and reserves and surveyed them starting in 2011. And he surveyed them again in 2012, 15, and 16. And I surveyed them again last summer. So we have this really nice long-term data set to look at how the bee community is changing over time, and also just to have very solid data year after year showing us the same patterns. And to look at that on a map, a satellite map, here's an example of our fragments. You'll recognize Lake Murray up here from the previous shot. And then there are large reserves. And this is the Sweetwater National Wildlife Refuge. And this is what our fragments look like on the ground if I take a photo. And the reserves, less development, but still close to town. And what James found was that there's lower native bee diversity in fragments, so fewer species. He also found lower native bee functional diversity, so fewer of those traits that I talked about earlier: sociality, diet, nesting type, all of those. And he also found that there are amplified effects following severe weather patterns. So in between his sample years, there was a severe drought, and instead of being upset that he couldn't catch any bees in those following years, he made lemonade out of those lemons and looked at how drought can impact native bees in conglomeration with the habitat loss and fragmentation. So to look at that in figures, reserves are in the dark gray. There are more species found in reserves, and in fragments are white boxes, fewer species, and the same goes for traits. And also the same pattern found. So functional traits on the y-axis and diversity on the x. And it's a very clear pattern that there are fewer traits, fewer bees found in fragments than there are reserves.
If I could make an input, the Camp Pendleton is a huge piece of geography, but I believe all of it is in San Diego County. Harvard University did a habitat study, and the overall conclusion was that it's been an excellent preservation area for many species. So when you look at the size of San Diego City, whatever, that's a huge piece of land. So I'm very fortunate to have that set aside, and they do have policies for habitat there.
That's fantastic. I'd love to see it myself. I admire it every time I drive by. But yeah. So just to put it on the map, there are fewer species in fragments and fewer in reserves. And so taking a closer look at that, which bee species are absent from fragments and why? So we see the patterns are clear, but what is driving these differences? And my interest is in range size. So range size is not just where one single individual can fly, it's where its species can survive globally. And the place that I see range size so nicely illustrated is in places like the Sibley's Bird Guide. And this is an example of the California quail, its habitat where it is able to live. And the same patterns go true for bees. So there are some species like this sweat bee, Halictus tripartitus, that can exist all over North America in the Western area. But then there are very specialized bees, ones like this fairy bee, Perdita meconis, that only goes to one type of flower, and it's only found in this very restricted range in Nevada and Utah. And these traits usually mean that these bees are really picky and probably will not handle things like large development very well. And James did start to see that in some of his analyses. He saw in reserves, it was only significant statistically in 2012, but in reserves, the average range size for bees is much smaller in reserves. So that means that more species in reserves have a small range size versus fragments. There are larger range size bees, but the smaller bees are not there to make smaller range size bees are not there to lower the average range size. And I wanted to take a closer look at what species are those with small traits or small range size. And a fantastic paper just came out with range size data for all of the species in our study. So I'm lucky enough to be able to mine data from that. And I found a very clear pattern. It's significant in 3 of the 4 survey years. I haven't finished identifying my bees from last year, so we don't have those data available yet. But in 2012, 15, and 16, we found fewer range restricted bees in fragments than we did reserves. So the range restricted species are those species with the 25% smallest range size of our entire species list. So we've observed about 150 species total. And so the bottom chunk of those, the bottom 25%, are those that I consider range restricted. And range restricted bees are very uncommon in fragments. And this is especially significant in this area. The California floristic province where we live is considered a biodiversity hotspot. And this person, Norman Myers, said, I think it was in 2001, that we should save these biodiversity hotspots we should put them towards conservation priority because they have so many highly endemic species. So if you're protecting these areas, you're protecting a higher number of species. And that includes range restricted species, endemics. So this is an area with not just endemic bees, but endemic plants, endemic birds, all very special area to study biodiversity. And something that I'm interested in further exploring is, we know what's in the fragments, we know what's in the reserves. Bees can fly, and I'm wondering if they can traverse the what I call the urban matrix to get from reserves to fragments and vice versa. So that's what's on my plate for next summer, hopefully, is sampling bees in this area to see which ones can get back and forth between fragments and reserves, or if there are any at all. And so the invitation to this talk said, native bees are in decline and how can you help? So I wanted to give some feedback on how to help, which may not be news to any of you, but document what you see. We remember this figure from earlier where there are so many data points missing. My favorite way to document what I see is through iNaturalist. So you can get the app on your phone and observe whatever you see and upload it. Oftentimes, I identify bees in Southern California. If I'm taking too long to get back to you, you can tag me. Further, what you can do if it's a cold day, for example, and bees aren't flying, you can help digitize museum records. There's this fantastic source called Notes from Nature, the Big Bee Bonanza. They've uploaded all of these bees that have labels that have not been transcribed yet, but they took photos of them. So you can go through and enter all of the information found on these labels and enter it. And then you are digitizing museum records, because one of the biggest holdup is not having access to these museum records that were collected in 1900 before we were even thinking about digitizing specimens. So this QR code takes you there, or it's Notes from Nature, and you can Google it and it'll come right up. There are also ways to do this with herbarium specimens if plants are your favorite. Another way to help is to promote biodiversity around you. I get a lot of questions about plant lists. So if you look at the Xerces Society website, you can click on your region and they will give you a plant list that will support different pollinators of all types season round. So it shows you the pollinators it supports and the bloom life of the different flower. It's really wonderful and really specific. So I'll paste that in the chat. And be careful with seed mixes. You might know this already, but a lot of the time introduced species are put into seed mixes, and we don't want to do that. Another way to help is to know which bees need saving. So there's been a push to put hives on roofs in cities, honeybee hives, and those bees are not in decline, and that's not biodiversity saving. That's introducing a competitor for food of native bees. So getting a beehive to save the bees is the same thing as getting a chicken coop to save the birds. You're better off planting plants to save native bees. And furthermore, you can keep learning about bees. Here are a few of my favorite books. A Buzz in the Meadow is a really great novel to read, but the Bees in Your Backyard and Bees of the World, A Guide to Every Family, are really great reference books to see what you're identifying. And the Museum of the Earth has a fantastic virtual museum exhibit about bees, where you can learn all kinds of stuff about bees and the evolution of bees and how to save them. So a great place. And I just wanted to thank all of our funding sources, the people who have helped us identify bees, collect them, and all of the land managers who gave us permission to survey on their land. And I'll take any questions.
Just another comment, Peter, here. I've gotten 2 or 3 repeat mailings from NRDC, and they have a strong focus on these, and they're looking at them. A factoid that's quite significant for bees, going to one of the paragraphs, the insecticides are certainly problematical when there's agriculture involved, but there's one type of insecticide that's newer than DDT, which is banned. And what's really significant here is it's, as far as toxicity to bees, it's 5,000, it says, to 10,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT. So I guess it's pretty widely used. NRDC has a program to pressure Congress, trying to get citizens involved to stop the use of the neonics insecticides. Apparently they're banned in Europe, but surprisingly, Europe is ahead of us in some of these preservation efforts. They're ahead of us.
Yeah. Yep. I'm curious to see where that goes. I think that there's evidence coming out all the time that it's not even just hurting, the neonicotinoids are not even just hurting bees that are alive right now, but it impacts the size and fitness of their offspring as well.
There's, and then they've come up, I just saw an alert about another old pesticide, dicamba or something that's been used forever and is all around, and they're finding that it could be, really impacting all kinds of invertebrates too. So there's so many of these pesticides that need to be, looked at and removed. So I guess we have to all buy organic and keep saying no to pesticide covered, materials and fruits and vegetables. And then Washington State just did something. What was that? The whole state, Jess?
Oh, they're trying to, I think it's I don't remember exactly. They're trying to work to recognize several bumblebee species as endangered.
Yeah.
Tien might know better.
I think that was it too. Yeah, I think that was true. Yeah. Now we had a question from Karen about hedgerows and how effective they are with farming using hedgerows. Do they help?
That's a great question. Yes, hedgerows are extremely effective, and you can forfeit some of your crop land to plant native flowers, and you won't have to truck in honeybee hives. So by creating habitat for pollinators in your agriculture setting, you have an unlimited source of free pollinators in your whatever you're growing. Almond, I think, is where they've done a lot of the studies. So yes, if you plant native flowers, a hedgerow strip, which I think is a practice in farming that's quite old that we kind of forgot about when we moved on to monoculture. It's really effective. So yes, that's great.
Yeah, if you take a look in the chat.
Yeah, so hedgerows in cities, that could be really great. Road medians, I really admire some of the road medians here. I see that they're putting in a lot of native plants, and that's great. And the 30 by 30, if you can just think of, if you are lucky enough to have a backyard, I don't have one, maybe one day, to plant native flowers, that can do a huge service to supporting pollinator communities, not just bees. And someone says, so yes, I mentioned that bees use pollen for a food source. And so for bees, pollen is their pure source of protein, and nectar is their carbohydrates. So bees will go and collect pollen. You can see in this picture, this bee has really hairy legs. That's what she uses to put pollen on. She doesn't have any in this picture, unfortunately. And she removes all of the pollen from her leg, or some bees put it on their tummy and make a little pollen ball mixed with nectar, and that's what they lay their egg on top of. And the egg hatches and eats eats the pollen as their protein source as it's developing into larva and pupa and eventually an adult. And as an adult, bees will eat pollen as well. And you ask if they turn it into honey. So no, not all, very few bees make honey actually. These just make little pollen pellets. I think bumblebees make little bits of honey pods, but nothing like having a giant comb that you can put in through centripetal force to get delicious honey. Most bees do not make honey. Also, the Smithsonian chickadee study pushing 70% native plants to sustain bird. Yes, that's exactly right. So planting native plants is not just for bees. It supports so much wildlife.
As far as making your yard more habitable for native bees, besides planting flowers, are there things that we should be doing? And even in the forests, you know, managing the forests, because there's a lot of talk about, I mean, I'm making this a more complicated question, but the forests, they're talking about all this clear cutting because to get the so-called fuel down. So management of public lands and your own yard for habitat, what's the best thing?
So since most bees are ground nesting, a great thing to do is to leave open bare ground for bees to nest in the soil. I think that not putting I don't know a lot about gardening, the weed reduction black stuff underneath. If you cannot do that so bees can nest, that's really helpful. You can get one of the bee hotels for cavity nesting bees. I just advise you to clean it if it's empty. And I think telling everyone that you know about native bees, because every conversation I have with someone, they're like completely mind blown that there's more than one bee. And it's really fun to see people just like, they get so excited about this fun little fact to have in their pocket. So have that fact in your pocket and tell everyone you know, I think is the most helpful thing. As far as clear cutting, that's definitely not great. But I think fire suppression is worse. So this is not something that I can speak too much on. So when I gave a similar talk to the California Native Plant Society, and I mentioned not to mulch your yard, and everyone was like, don't mulch our yard. That's how we keep our house from burning down. So there's like very few band-aids to support biodiversity. So my best tips are plant flowers, leave a little bit of bare soil if you can, try and avoid planting a lot of grass.
Jess, I have a question.
Okay.
Yes.
Here. Hi, you did a great job.
Thank you.
So my question is, like, earlier you showed like that topograph and you were talking about how fragmented land, and if the bees can overcome the area to a reserve land, right? That you wanted to look at maybe?
Yeah.
The urban matrix. Thank you, Joyce. Has anyone looked at, or do you have data that's available that looks at the property tax? Because that's public information, to see if, because people that have resources, monetary resources specifically, can invest into a beautiful garden and have a large, lovely land reserve for bees, a bee haven, but people with less resources may not be able to afford that. So has anyone looked at that type of urban matrix with income matrix as well, and how that looks with bee diversity too?
I know that there's a student right now working on that at the University of Colorado Boulder. And there's also a professor, Elsa Youngstedt, I think in North Carolina, looking at that. But you're exactly right. You can't just tell everyone, plant some flowers in your nice, beautiful yard, because not everyone has a yard, or they feed themselves before feeding the bees. So absolutely. I think outreach is one of the better ways to talk about saving the bees than just telling people what to do with their yards. But definitely look for research from Asia Kaiser is her name, and Elsa Youngstadt looking at that.
I know you'll tell me because you're always in the know.
I wanted to add from in western Riverside County, which is where I guess most of us probably live. Many of the water districts have native garden demonstration. I call them gardens or plots, whatever. And I know there's probably like a handful, but they're quite valuable if people are looking at trying to choose native plants to native landscape their yards. So that's potentially a good resource to look at planting our surrounding habitat, our own habitat, with something native.
Yeah.
Yeah, we Karen is our member. Karen has created a beautiful guide that shows designs and the local plants to plant, everything you need to know about a native plant garden in our area. So it's on our website. So we're the Santa Margarita Group Sierra Club. So if you can't find it, just email me. She's done a good.
I can put a link to, yeah, I can put the link in the chat for the guide.
Yeah, it's a beautiful guide that she's done.
That's wonderful.
And
I
we
see
have Denise
another
with a question.
Pardon?
Yeah, Denise has a question.
Oh, sure. Yes. And I see there's one just before Denise from Carrie. So when a bee makes a nest in the ground, how deep do these nests go? Are they complex networks underground? So that really depends on the species. Some bees will nest several meters deep in the ground. Some will nest only several inches in the ground. And they're like really perfect tubes. Like bees are fantastic plumbers. And they do a hole straight down, and then they go to the side with a nest cell. So if we think about plumbing, so the water doesn't fill the nest all the way up, it goes off to the side. And it's very tidy. It's not a big, messy, complex structure. Denise has asked a question. I have decomposed gravel as a ground cover around my native plants. Can digger bees dig through this, or should I save bare soil? I would save a little bare soil, maybe near your plants. And it is great to have gravel because then you're not using water on lawn. But if you can afford to have a few little patches, you might make some habitat for ground nesting bees.
And again, in western Riverside County, in putting the habitat plan together, many of the wildlife corridors for all different kinds of species are actually rivers or stream beds, and we all know this is an arid area. But generally, the stream locations throughout our part of the wildlife corridors. So I guess narrowing this down to a question, how do bees do in a kind of let's call it a riparian area where you've got some kind of natural habitat on both sides, which goes down to what may be a stream bed?
Some will still nest underground. There's this crazy species of bee that nests under seasonal flooded plains that is covered with water for 6 months a year. So the water, and if we're thinking along a stream, doesn't completely scare them away. There are some that will specialize on that habitat, or they'll nest just a little bit outside of the riparian habitat, but visit it for pollen and nectar resources. So that definitely still really great habitat for them.
Good.
Someone says,
Melissa?
hey, from Texas, do bees nest in sandy loam type of soil? There are some species that do, yes. There are some bees that are so intense, they'll even dig holes in sandstone. So that lots of nesting substrates for them, but the sandy soil won't scare them away.
Nice. Mhm. Oh, I have one question too is, are there certain predators that are really, I mean, the competition from honeybees is a big deal, but are there some predators that are really, are hard on native bees?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that their biggest predator are probably parasites and pathogens. And I think that especially for native bees, that's still largely unknown. Winnie the Pooh, Tien says, that's true. Winnie the Pooh, he's like really loves bees. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. So,
If you have
does anybody? Oh, here.
one more question. If you have bees on your property, how would you locate their nests? That's really tricky. I've found most of my nests by stumbling upon them. There's a really fantastic iNaturalist project called Nesting Bees, where people have uploaded pictures of different nests that they've found. So if you look at those can be really great examples of what a nest looks like. But they can be perfect holes on the ground or a conglomeration of pebbles on the side of a rock or a twig. They're really diverse what they look like.
Oh, that's fun.
Any more questions? All right.
Well, thanks so much, Jess.
Of course.
Really, really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll say goodnight and next time, well, everybody that wants to come to our executive committee, the next one is on April 4th. So some of you from Texas probably won't be joining us, but but look for any of our announcements, or if you want my announcements, just send me an email. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you, Jess.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.